The steam catapult fired at 0430 hours, and Lieutenant Koji Tanaka felt the Zero fighter surge forward with acceleration that pressed him into his seat like a giant hand. The carrier Akagi fell away beneath him as he climbed into pre-dawn darkness over the Pacific, the smell of aviation fuel and salt air sharp in the oxygen mask clamped to his face. Behind him, the flight deck was already spotting another aircraft for launch. The organized chaos of carrier operations that Tanaka had witnessed 100 times since the war began 6 months ago at Pearl Harbor. He banked left, forming up with the other fighters in his squadron, watching their navigation lights blink green against black sky. Below, the Kido Butai steamed in perfect formation. 4 fleet carriers arranged in a box with screening destroyers and cruisers surrounding them like protective wolves. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had swept through the Indian Ocean destroying British ships, that had seemed invincible for so long that invincibility had become an expectation rather than a hope. Tanaka could see their wakes glowing with phosphorescence, white trails marking their passage through dark water. "All aircraft, this is Flight Leader," Commander Tomonaga's voice crackled in Tanaka's headset. "Maintain formation. We strike Midway Island at first light, destroy their airfield and return for second wave." Tanaka acknowledged with 2 clicks of his radio transmit button. He'd flown this mission profile before, at Wake Island, at Rabaul, at Darwin. Attack at dawn when the enemy was still waking up, achieve surprise, deliver overwhelming force, withdraw before effective resistance could organize. The Imperial Navy had perfected the carrier strike, turned it into a science of destruction that no enemy had successfully countered. But something felt different this morning. Tanaka couldn't identify what exactly, just a subtle wrongness in the air, a tension that went beyond normal pre-combat nerves. Admiral Nagumo had seemed distracted during yesterday's briefing, his answers to questions shorter than usual, his confidence less absolute. And the intelligence reports were contradictory, some claiming the American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor, others suggesting they might be in the area. The uncertainty bothered Tanaka more than he wanted to admit. The formation flew northeast through darkness that gradually lightened to grey, then pale blue as the sun climbed over the horizon behind them. Midway appeared as a smudge on the ocean ahead, 2 tiny islands connected by a sandbar, surrounded by reef and shallow water that turned the ocean turquoise. American anti-aircraft fire began as the first wave crossed the beach, black puffs of flak, streams of tracer rounds arcing up from defensive positions. Tanaka watched the dive bombers ahead peel off and attack, their payloads releasing to fall on runways and hangars. Explosions bloomed orange and red. Fires spread. The Americans were fighting back hard, their fighters climbing to intercept, but they were too few and too slow. The Japanese formation pressed the attack with professional efficiency, dropping bombs and firing machine guns, methodically dismantling the island's defences. "Airfield destroyed," Tomonaga reported after 20 minutes. "Fuel tanks burning, but we need a second strike. Their defences are still operational." Tanaka felt his stomach tighten. A second strike meant rearming and refueling back on the carriers, meant more time exposed, meant delaying any response if American ships appeared. But Tomonaga was right. The job wasn't finished. The formation withdrew at 0630 hours, leaving Midway burning behind them. The flight back took 90 minutes, the Zeros climbing to escort altitude, while bomber crews checked for damage. Tanaka scanned the ocean constantly, searching for the telltale white wakes of ships. The water remained empty in all directions, just endless blue stretching to the horizon. Where are the American carriers? He wondered. Are they really still at Pearl Harbor? Or are they out here somewhere, watching, waiting? Akagi appeared at 0800 hours, her flight deck clear and ready for recovery. Tanaka brought his Zero around in the landing pattern, watching the deck crew signal him in. The landing was routine: catch the wire, fold wings, taxi forward. He shut down the engine and climbed from the cockpit to find the deck in organized chaos. Aircraft were being struck below to the hangar deck for rearming, Torpedoes were being removed and replaced with bombs for the second strike against Midway. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck. Ordnance crews pushed bomb carts. The smell of aviation fuel was overwhelming, the deck slick with it, puddles forming around refueling aircraft. "Tanaka!" His squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Kobayashi, waved him over. "Get some food, get some rest. We launch again in 2 hours for the second Midway strike." "Has there been any word about American carriers?" Kobayashi's expression darkened. "Reconnaissance reports a contact. 1 carrier, maybe 2, bearing northeast. But Admiral Nagumo hasn't decided whether to strike them or finish Midway first. 1 carrier, maybe 2. Tanaka felt the wrongness intensify. The Americans knew the Kido Butai was here. They had to know. And if they knew, they were already launching strikes, already sending their aircraft to attack, while the Japanese carriers were vulnerable with aircraft being rearmed. He was climbing down to the hangar deck when the alarm sounded. The klaxon was deafening, bouncing off metal bulkheads, sending men running to battle stations. "Enemy aircraft approaching!" the loudspeaker blared. "All hands to battle stations! Enemy aircraft approaching!" Tanaka reversed course, climbing back to the flight deck. The scene had transformed in seconds, fuel hoses being disconnected, bombs being hastily secured, fighters trying to launch to intercept the incoming attack. But the deck was crowded with aircraft in various states of readiness, some armed with torpedoes, some with bombs, some with nothing, all of them leaking fuel. He reached his zero just as the first American dive bombers appeared, SBD Dauntlesses, coming from high altitude in near vertical dives. The anti-aircraft batteries opened up, filling the sky with flak, but the Americans kept coming, kept diving, committed to their attack, runs with determination that bordered on suicidal. "Get airborne!" someone was screaming. "Get fighters airborne!" But it was too late. The first bomb hit Akagi at 1022 hours, striking just aft of the midship elevator. Tanaka felt the deck lurch beneath his feet, heard the tremendous explosion, saw flames erupt from the elevator opening. He was thrown against his Zero's wing, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The bomb had penetrated to the hangar deck, where aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs were waiting to launch. The explosion touched off a chain reaction of secondary detonations as ordnance cooked off. The hangar became a blast furnace, flames shooting up through the elevator opening, superheated air making it impossible to breathe. A second bomb hit near the bridge, a third hit forward, tearing a hole in the flight deck 20 feet across. Tanaka watched deck crew disappear in the explosions, simply vanishing as fire and shrapnel consumed them. The heat was incredible, his exposed skin blistering. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. Shock, he realized distantly, his body shutting down from sensory overload. Someone grabbed him, Kobayashi, his face black with soot. "Abandon ship! The carrier is lost! Abandon ship!" They ran toward the starboard side, dodging debris and fires, and men screaming for help. The flight deck was tilting now as Akagi began to list. More explosions from below as aviation fuel tanks ruptured. The smell of burning flesh mixed with burning oil and aviation fuel, creating a stench that would haunt Tanaka for the rest of his life. He jumped from the catwalk, falling 20 feet into water that was warm and thick with oil. The surface was already crowded with swimmers, men clinging to debris, men who weren't swimming at all but just floating face down. Tanaka swam away from the carrier, his flight suit heavy with water, his arms burning with exhaustion. Behind him, Akagi was dying, fires consuming her from within, secondary explosions walking down her length, her bow already starting to rise as the stern settled. A destroyer appeared, lowering rope nets for survivors. Tanaka grabbed one and climbed, his hands slipping on the wet rope, other men climbing around him. He reached the deck and collapsed, coughing up seawater and oil, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. "Look," someone said, pointing. Tanaka followed the gesture and saw what had been invisible from water level. Kaga was burning a mile to the south, her entire flight deck engulfed in flames. Soryu was burning 3 miles east, listing heavily, her crew abandoning ship. The American dive bombers had struck all 3 carriers within minutes of each other, catching them with their aircraft being rearmed, their decks crowded with fuel and ordnance, their defences distracted by torpedo bombers that had attacked first and been annihilated. Only Hiryu remained operational, her fighters already launching to protect the task force. But one carrier against what might be multiple American carriers? The mathematics had shifted catastrophically. How did this happen? Kobayashi appeared beside Tanaka, his voice barely audible. We were winning. We had them. How did this happen? Tanaka had no answer. 5 minutes ago, the Kido Butai had been the most powerful carrier force in the world. Now, 3 of its 4 carriers were dying, their crews swimming in oil-slicked water, their aircraft lost, their operational effectiveness destroyed. The Americans had achieved what seemed impossible, a perfect strike at the perfect moment against an enemy that had become complacent in its dominance. It was luck, Tanaka said finally. They got lucky. But he didn't believe it. Luck was finding the enemy. This was precision. Hitting 3 carriers within 6 minutes, destroying each one with just a few bombs because they'd been caught vulnerable. This was what happened when you underestimated your opponent, when you assumed victory was inevitable, when you forgot that war could turn on a single moment of bad timing. The destroyer took them to a cruiser, which took them to another destroyer as the fleet organized rescue operations. Tanaka stood on deck and watched Akagi burn through the afternoon, the flames visible for miles. Admiral Nagumo ordered her scuttled at 1900 hours, destroyers firing torpedoes into the carrier he'd commanded from Pearl Harbor to Midway. She sank at 1925 hours, her bow rising nearly vertical before sliding beneath the waves. Kaga had sunk hours earlier. Soryu followed at 1913 hours. Hiryu survived until the next morning, launching one final strike that damaged the American carrier Yorktown before dive bombers found her too. She burned through the night, a pillar of fire visible for 30 miles, before she finally went down at 0900 hours on June 5th. 4 carriers lost in 24 hours. The heart of Japan's carrier striking force destroyed. Over 3,000 men dead. Hundreds of aircraft gone. And more than ships and aircraft and men, the aura of invincibility that had sustained the Japanese advance for 6 months shattered in minutes of precise American bombing. Tanaka spent the rest of the war flying from land bases, training new pilots who had fewer hours in the cockpit than he'd had combat missions, watching the quality of naval aviation decline as experienced aviators died and weren't replaced. He flew in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in 1944, watched Japanese formations get massacred by American fighters that were faster, more heavily armed, flown by pilots with better training. He flew against the B-29 raids on the home islands in 1945, his Zero barely able to reach the bomber's altitude, his guns ineffective against their armor. But he never forgot Midway, never stopped replaying those 6 minutes when American dive bombers had caught the Kido Butai with its pants down, never stopped wondering what might have been different if the reconnaissance planes had found the American carriers earlier, if Nagumo had launched his strike immediately instead of rearming for a second Midway attack, if the combat air patrol had intercepted the dive bombers before they reached attack position. The war ended in August 1945 with atomic bombs and Soviet invasion and Japanese surrender. Tanaka returned to a country devastated by fire bombings and starvation, to cities that were rubble, to a population that no longer believed in the divine destiny of the empire. He worked in his uncle's fishing business, married in 1948, had 3 children, lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to the years when he'd flown combat missions against enemies who wanted to kill him. In 1967, he attended a reunion of Midway survivors in Tokyo. 43 men gathered in a hotel conference room, drinking sake and telling stories about the battle, trying to make sense of what had happened 25 years ago. Most spoke about the bravery of the crews, the sacrifice of men who'd stayed at their posts while their ships burned. Some spoke about tactical errors, strategic miscalculations, the arrogance that had let Japan believe it could defeat America's industrial might. Tanaka said little. What could he add? That he'd watched the Imperial Navy's carrier force destroyed in 6 minutes? That he'd spent 25 years wondering if he could have done something different, flown harder, fought better, somehow changed the outcome? That the smell of burning ships still woke him at night, that he still heard the screams of men who'd burned alive on Akagi's hangar deck. Late in the evening, after most had left, an old man approached him. His name was Nakamura, a radioman who'd survived Kaga's sinking. They'd never met, but shared the bond of men who'd been there, who'd seen what couldn't be unseen. "Do you think we could have won?" Nakamura asked quietly. "If Midway had gone differently, if we'd sunk their carriers and kept ours, could we have won the war?" Tanaka thought about it, swirling the sake in his cup. "No," he said finally. "We'd have won the battle, delayed the inevitable. But America could build carriers faster than we could sink them, train pilots faster than we could kill them. Midway didn't lose us the war. It just made the end visible. Then what did we die for? We didn't die. We lived. The ones who died, they died because old men made decisions that young men paid for, same as every war." Nakamura nodded slowly, finished his sake, stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. "I still see Kaga sinking. Every time I close my eyes. Does it ever stop?" "No," Tanaka said. "It never stops." He died in 1983, 63 years old, his body worn out by years of work and the lingering effects of injuries from the war. His children found his pilot's logbook while sorting through his possessions, discovered he'd flown 127 combat missions over 3 years of war. They asked why he'd never spoken about it, why he'd hidden this significant part of his life from his family. His wife, who'd lived through the fire bombings and starvation and occupation, who'd rebuilt her life from ashes, said simply, "Some things are too heavy to share. Let him rest." At the funeral, 3 other Midway survivors attended, old men now, stooped and grey, wearing their war medals for perhaps the last time. They stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, each lost in private memories of a battle that had happened 41 years ago, but felt like yesterday. One of them placed a small origami crane on the casket, a symbol of peace. Another placed a photograph, Akagi at sea in 1942, magnificent and powerful, 6 months before she became a reef in the Pacific. The third simply bowed once, deeply, then walked away without speaking. The 3 carriers that sank at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, rest in water too deep for salvage, their wrecks slowly corroding, becoming part of the ocean floor. Hiryu lies near them, her final resting place discovered decades later by deep-sea exploration. Together they form an underwater graveyard, marking the moment when the tide of war turned, when Japanese expansion reached its high water mark and began to recede. In archives and museums and fading memories, the Battle of Midway is remembered as a turning point, a decisive American victory, proof that skill and intelligence could overcome numerical disadvantage. The men who fought there, American and Japanese alike, are remembered as heroes, brave warriors who did their duty against overwhelming odds. But for the survivors like Tanaka, who lived with the memories of that day in June 1942, it was something else entirely. It was the moment when certainty became doubt, when invincibility became vulnerability, when the future that had seemed assured revealed itself as illusion. It was watching friends die in burning water, watching carriers that had seemed eternal sink beneath the waves, watching an empire's destiny change in 6 minutes of perfectly executed American dive bombing. The ocean keeps such memories. It holds the wrecks and the bodies and the truth that no official history can fully capture, that wars are won and lost not by grand strategies or divine will, but by men making decisions under pressure, by luck and timing, and the cruel mathematics of explosive power meeting vulnerable targets at exactly the wrong moment. And somewhere beneath the Pacific, in darkness and silence and cold, 4 carriers rest side by side, monuments to the day when everything changed, when Japan's sword finally met a shield it couldn't penetrate, when the inevitable march to victory revealed itself as the first step toward defeat. The water remembers. It always has.